Alabama, let's get it.
The process, no one can stop this. Hottest show in the streets, I bet you can't top this. Rammer, jammer, yellow hammer, come see how we rock this. Alabama fans the best, there's no way you can top this. Recruiting news and interviews, just sit back and watch this.
Recruiting news and interviews, just sit back and watch this.
The process.
Welcome into a new episode of The Process. Crimson Tide Recruiting, your home for Tide football recruiting news every Tuesday and Thursday evening right here on our YouTube page. As always, I am your host, Justin Smith, the scouting and recruiting analyst for Touchdown Alabama magazine. To close out this week of shows, I want to discuss a possible big weekend for the Tide on the recruiting trail as Sage Ryan, a 5-star defensive back out of Louisiana, will announce his commitment on Saturday. He will choose between the Tide, Clemson, and LSU. I will talk about what a commitment from Ryan would mean for the Tide's 2021 recruiting class. I will also discuss the Tide's 2021 4-star athlete commit Kadarius Callaway with the Tide taking on Mississippi State this weekend. I want to discuss why Mississippi State is still going after Kadarius Callaway and why the Tide really need to hold on to this special athlete in this 2021 recruiting class. But before I get into those subjects, I do have to hit you guys for some recruiting updates. So we're going to dive right into those first. So with that being said, let's get the process started. We are going to get these recruiting updates started with the Tide losing a commitment from 2022 5-star linebacker Jeremiah Alexander out of Thompson High School in Thompson, Alabama. With them decommitting from the Tide currently have one commit in the 2022 recruiting class in 4-star linebacker Robert Williard out of Williamson High School inside the state of Alabama as well. When you look at Alexander's recruitment, he did commit to the Tide a bit early. I think the Tide will still be involved in his recruitment moving forward. Before he committed, he did have a top 3 of Alabama, LSU, and Georgia. I expect all 3 of those teams to be strong favorites for the in-state recruit moving forward in this recruitment. So Jeremiah Alexander is definitely a recruit to pay attention to, with them being a 5-star linebacker, one of the top prospects in the 2022 recruiting class. Moving over to another recruiting update which surrounds the Tide's 2021 4-star linebacker commit Deontay Lawson out of Mobile Christian School in Mobile, Alabama. He recently received its All-American Bowl jersey. He will not be able to participate in the game this season due to the fact that the game was canceled due to COVID-19. Bet recruits and commits all across the country get an opportunity to receive their jersey, although they will not be able to play in the game. So huge congratulations goes out to the Tide commit out of Mobile. I want to also send some congratulations out to the Tide's 2021 3-star tight end commit in Robbie Ouzts, who was recently named as a finalist for the Mr. Football Award inside the state of South Carolina. It looks as if the Tide tight end commit is having a big season inside South Carolina. So the Tide commits are continuing to impress during their senior seasons. I think the Tide will continue to make some moves in the 2022 recruiting class. I think that is something to pay attention to with Jeremiah Alexander decommitting. The Tide will continue to recruit that class a little bit more, trying to turn their attention to it, but they also want to close out the 2021 recruiting cycle in impressive fashion. And Sage Ryan, the guy I will talk about next, could play a huge factor in that. Sage Ryan is set to announce his commitment on Saturday at noon Central Time. And when you look at his recruitment, the Tide, Clemson, and LSU have been heavily involved throughout. I think the Tide were fortunate to get him on campus in March for one of their junior day events. I think that was huge for the Tide, getting him on campus on March 7th, because we have seen during this 2021 recruiting cycle where recruits pulled on getting an opportunity to visit the University of Alabama before COVID-19 and global pandemic impacted recruiting visits as one of the reasons why they committed to the Tide. They felt really comfortable during those visits. You even had Monkel Goodwine, who is currently committed to the Tide, a 4-star defensive end out of Maryland, coming out recently and stating that he committed to the Tide because he was able to get on campus, and it was one of the few schools he was able to visit before COVID-19 and the global pandemic impacted the recruiting landscape. So I think it has played a huge role. When you look at the Tide's 2021 recruiting class, they were able to get Quincy McKinstry on campus, Kane Williams on campus, Ian Jackson on campus, among some other guys who eventually committed to the Tide. So getting those guys on campus before COVID-19 shut those visits down has been huge for the Tide on the recruiting trail in this 2021 recruiting cycle, and it could be huge for the Tide when it comes to Ryan's recruitment. When you look at Sage Ryan, he's a bit of a bigger defensive back, a true athlete out of Lafayette, Louisiana, a kid who has a 5'11", 193-pound frame, a guy who's not afraid to come downhill and just lay guys out. So I think he's very active when it comes to being in the secondary. This would be a huge pickup for the Crimson Tide. And when you look at their 2021 recruiting class, the impressive defensive backs that they currently have verbally committed, he would join the likes of Kane Williams, the 4-star safety out of Louisiana, Devontae Smith, a 4-star defensive back out of Ohio, Kyrie Jackson, a 4-star JUCO defensive back out of the DMV area. You also join guys like Quincy McKinstry, the 5-star athlete, one of the top cornerbacks in the nation when it comes to that impressive defensive back group the Tide has verbally committed, along with an impressive athlete and 4-star Kadarius Calloway out of Philadelphia High School in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And if you add Sage Ryan to that group, that is a complete defensive back group. You do not need another defensive back. And that is where it gets pretty interesting for the Crimson Tide, because you know that they have recruited Terrion Arnold very hard throughout this 2021 recruiting cycle. And Arnold is a gifted athlete, a true defensive back, a technically sound guy who the Tide's coaching staff really likes. Nick Saban has been very heavily involved in his recruitment. But when you look at Sage Ryan and when you look at Terrion Arnold, those are the tough decisions that I have been talking about for the last couple of weeks when it comes to what the Tide's coaching staff would have to do moving forward here in this 2021 recruiting cycle. So it'll be interesting to see if the Tide continues to recruit Arnold hard. If they land Sage Ryan, it's going to be hard. It's hard for me to think that they will continue to recruit Arnold with the same intensity that they have in the past, knowing that they have this great defensive back group and they still have to add guys at different positions to this 2021 recruiting class. So that is something to definitely pay attention to. But if they do miss out on Ryan, you still have Arnold there. They have recruited him very heavily. They have shown some major interest in him. They have done a great job of staying in contact with them. So if they miss out on Ryan, I don't think they will pick up the momentum when it comes to Terrion Arnold, because I don't think they can even recruit him harder in the way that they are recruiting him. It is just the fact that he is holding off and taking his recruitment very slowly. So that is something to pay attention to, along with the fact that Terrion Arnold and one of the top linebacker targets at the moment, and Xavier Sori, are considered a package deal. They do want to compete together at the next level. So those are just a few of the recruiting storylines we are continuing to pay attention to as this 2021 recruiting cycle moves forward. I am not 100% confident to put my prediction in for Sage Ryan's decision upcoming on this Saturday. I have had people tell me that they feel he will commit to the Tide. I will make my decision most likely on Saturday morning and release it over at touchdownalabama.com. But this would be a huge get for the Crimson Tide in this 2021 recruiting class. So it is definitely something to pay attention to, as the Tide will look to close out this class in impressive fashion, with so many talented prospects still out there, still being a possibility for the Tide to bring them in their 2021 recruiting class. But before I close out this show today, I want to discuss a guy who is currently verbally committed to the Tide, and Kadarius Calloway, the 4-star athlete out of Philadelphia High School in Philadelphia, Mississippi. I recently got a chance to see him in action a couple of weeks ago, and I was very impressed. I talked about it a couple of times already, but he really blew me away with this performance. And when you think about the Tide competing against Mississippi State on this weekend, Kadarius Calloway was once verbally committed to the Bulldogs before he flipped his commitment to the Crimson Tide. I think at that moment, a lot of Tide fans did not realize how big that was Personally, I did not realize how big it was until I got an opportunity to see Kadarius Callaway in person. He has explosive, elite speed. I'm talking Jalen Waddle, Henry Ruggs type of speed, Christian Leary type of speed. And unlike those guys, he will bring that to the defensive side of football, which is something that I am really excited to see a guy with that type of speed attack on the defensive side of the football for the Crimson Tide. A guy who can use that speed to come downhill and create some great closing speed scenarios. Also be able to make up for mistakes. This is a kid with that type of speed. He may get beat, may get gapped a little bit, but with speed like that, you can make up for some mistakes. And he is very physical with that 6'2", 200 pounds plus frame. And when you look at him, when you get a chance, if you ever get a chance to see him in person, he's built like a running back for the most part. So I was very impressed. I think the Tide are going to try to hold on to this guy as much as they can, as hard as they can. I think he is pretty locked in with the Tide, with this relationship with the Tide's defensive line coach, Freddie Roach, who is the Mississippi area recruiter and the main recruiter for Kadarius Callaway. So I think Callaway is a huge get for the Crimson Tide. I think it is vital for them to hold on to this particular guy because I think he is very, very impressive and underrated prospect. We currently have him listed as a 4-star athlete now over in our own independent recruiting rankings after watching him play on a couple of weeks ago against Forest High School from Philadelphia High School. I wrote a more in-depth story on Kadarius Callaway performance over at touchdownalabama.com. It is free, so be sure to check out that. I go more in-depth about what I saw from Kadarius Callaway throughout that game, from the smaller things to the bigger things that really stood out to me about the Mississippi product. So that's what I wanted to discuss on this episode of The Process. That will do it for this episode of The Process. Be sure to hit that subscribe button below before you leave. Then head over to touchdownalabama.com. Pick up your subscription today. With that subscription, you will be able to read all of our subscriber-only articles. Get your hands on our yearly print magazine issue. Read our in-depth scouting reports on each Tide commit in each recruiting class. Also read our in-depth draft projection for each Tide player who are eligible to declare for the NFL draft in that given year. Also, be sure to download the Touchdown Alabama app. It is located in the Google Play Store as well as the Apple App Store. So be sure to download that app so breaking news notifications can be sent to your mobile device from the staff here at touchdownalabama.com. As always, I am Justin Smith, the scouting and recruiting analyst for Touchdown Alabama magazine.
Watch this. The Process.